Captain Taishi Yamamoto's world exploded in fire and confusion as high explosive rounds tore through the Akatsuki's starboard side with surgical precision. He gripped the bridge railing, his knuckles white against the cold steel, as his mind struggled to process the impossible. They were invisible, protected by a fog so thick that visibility measured less than 30 meters in any direction. Yet somewhere out there in that impenetrable gray void, an enemy they could not see was destroying his ship with an accuracy that defied every principle of naval warfare he had learned over 23 years of service. The date was November 14, 1943, and in the next 28 minutes, everything Captain Yamamoto believed about naval combat would be proven catastrophically obsolete. This is the story of how a single technological leap transformed centuries of maritime warfare doctrine overnight, and how one man's journey from absolute confidence to stunned disbelief became a microcosm of the Imperial Japanese Navy's painful awakening to a reality where traditional advantages meant nothing against invisible electronic eyes that could pierce any darkness, penetrate any fog, and track any target with mechanical precision that seemed almost supernatural. But to understand how this moment arrived, we must go back 6 hours earlier, when the mission seemed like a routine supply run that would exploit Japan's greatest tactical advantage. The morning briefing aboard the Akatsuki had carried an air of quiet confidence that permeated every corner of the ship. Captain Yamamoto studied the meteorological charts spread across the wardroom table, his experienced eyes tracing the massive weather system moving across the Solomon Sea. The fog bank was enormous, stretching for hundreds of kilometers, with visibility predicted to remain below 50 meters for at least 12 hours. It was exactly the kind of weather that Japanese naval forces had learned to exploit with devastating effectiveness throughout the Pacific campaign. Lieutenant Kenji Sato stood beside his captain, reviewing the mission parameters one final time. At 26 years old, Sato represented the new generation of Imperial Navy officers, men who had come of age during the war itself and knew nothing but combat. He had survived 7 major surface engagements, watched ships sink beneath the waves, pulled wounded comrades from burning compartments, and learned to function under pressure that would have broken lesser men. The thick fog settling across the sea felt like a gift from the gods themselves. The mission was straightforward in concept, but critical in execution. 3 destroyers, the Akatsuki, the Kazuchi, and the Inazuma, would carry 400 tons of ammunition, medical supplies, and food to the increasingly desperate garrison at Bougainville. American forces had been tightening the noose around the Japanese-held island for months, interdicting supply convoys with aircraft during daylight hours and patrolling the surrounding waters with destroyers at night. The garrison situation was becoming increasingly precarious, and this supply run represented their lifeline for another month of operations. Yamamoto traced the planned route with his finger, his voice carrying the calm authority that had made him a respected commander throughout the fleet. They would depart at sunset, timing their run to place them in the middle of the fog bank during the darkest hours of the night. American patrol aircraft would be grounded by the weather. Surface vessels would be rendered effectively blind by conditions that reduced the world to a small bubble of gray visibility. The Japanese ships, meanwhile, would rely on compass navigation, dead reckoning, and the superior night vision training that had given them such a decisive edge in previous engagements. The tactical calculus seemed unassailable. American forces had numbers, certainly. Their industrial capacity produced warships at a rate that sometimes seemed impossible, as if entire fleets materialized from thin air. But numbers meant nothing if you could not find your target. The fog would be their shield, their invisibility cloak, their guarantee of safe passage through waters that had become increasingly dangerous as American forces pushed deeper into the Solomon Islands. What Captain Yamamoto did not know, what he could not have known given the intelligence available to Japanese forces at that time, was that his confidence rested on assumptions that had already become dangerously outdated. The Americans had developed capabilities that fundamentally altered the nature of naval warfare, capabilities that rendered traditional advantages like superior night vision and careful navigation as quaint as cavalry charges in an age of machine guns. As the Akatsuki slipped her moorings at 1700 hours, her crew moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had performed these tasks hundreds of times before. 198 sailors occupied every station throughout the ship, from the engine rooms, where massive turbines would soon be pushing the destroyer to speeds exceeding 30 knots, to the gun mounts where crews checked and rechecked their 5-inch weapons, to the torpedo tubes where the fearsome Type 93 long lance torpedoes waited in silent readiness. The Type 93 represented one of Japan's significant technological advantages at the war's outset. Driven by pure oxygen instead of compressed air, these torpedoes could travel 40,000 meters at 48 knots while carrying a warhead containing nearly 500 kilograms of high explosives. Allied sailors had learned to fear them, giving them the grim nickname Long Lance after watching them sink ship after ship in the war's early years. They were technological marvels, products of Japanese engineering excellence and tactical innovation. But technology moves faster than doctrine, and the Japanese Navy had failed to recognize that the fundamental nature of naval warfare was shifting beneath their feet in ways that would render even the finest torpedoes useless. You could not accurately target them against an enemy who could see you while remaining invisible themselves. Lieutenant Sato made his rounds through the ship as they cleared the harbor, checking readiness at each station. The crew's morale was high, buoyed by the protective weather that seemed to guarantee a successful mission. Several of the younger sailors, men barely out of their teens, who had known nothing but war since entering service, commented that they felt safer than they had in months. The fog was their ally, their friend, their protector against American air power and surface patrols. In the cramped combat information center deep within the Akatsuki's hull, the ship's Type 22 radar set sat powered down, its cathode ray tube display dark and lifeless. Japanese radar technology had never matched the sophistication of Allied systems, plagued by reliability issues and limited range that made it more a backup to visual detection than a primary sensor system. More critically, Japanese naval doctrine emphasized radio silence and minimal electromagnetic emissions during operations, based on concerns that radar transmissions might be detected by enemy equipment and reveal their positions. The irony was profound and tragic. Japanese concerns about radar detection had caused them to turn off the one device that might have provided warning of approaching danger, while American radar operators would soon be tracking their every movement with casual confidence. It was a perfect encapsulation of how technological advantage could reverse the fortunes of war when one side fully embraced innovation while the other remained bound by traditional doctrine. As darkness fell and the fog thickened around them, Captain Yamamoto allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The three destroyers had formed up in a perfect textbook screening formation, maintaining precise spacing through careful navigation and the use of carefully shielded signal lamps that could only be seen at extremely close range. The fog had grown so dense that even these limited visual references were difficult to maintain, reducing each ship to a gray ghost barely visible against the surrounding murk. The seas remained calm, the engines purred with mechanical reliability, and the navigation was proceeding exactly according to plan. They would reach the delivery point 45 minutes ahead of schedule, complete the supply transfer under cover of darkness and fog, and return to base before dawn brought the risk of American air attack. It seemed like the perfect execution of a well-planned operation that exploited every Japanese advantage while minimizing enemy strengths. Lieutenant Sato returned to the bridge with a report that morale throughout the ship remained excellent despite the oppressive conditions. The crew understood the critical nature of their cargo and drew strength from the protective fog that surrounded them. Several sailors had expressed relief at finally having a mission that seemed to favor their forces rather than exposing them to American numerical superiority and air power. Yamamoto nodded his acknowledgement, though his eyes never left the impenetrable wall of gray beyond the bridge windows. He was too experienced, too cautious by nature, to allow confidence to become complacency. He had survived this long by always assuming the enemy was more capable than they appeared, by never taking anything for granted, by maintaining constant vigilance even in situations that seemed to favor Japanese forces. Yet even his caution and experience could not prepare him for what was developing 120 kilometers to the south, where a very different type of crew was watching his task force with perfect clarity despite the fog that seemed to render detection impossible. The USS Fletcher S radar room hummed with electronic activity as Lieutenant Commander James Patterson studied the glowing green display with intense concentration. The cathode ray tube painted his face with an otherworldly luminescence as he watched 3 distinct blips moving across the screen with mechanical precision. Each rotation of the antenna brought fresh data, and the picture was unmistakably clear. 3 ships traveling in perfect formation, bearing 340 degrees, range 119,000 meters and closing at a combined speed of 44 knots. Seaman Robert Chen made minute adjustments to the radar controls with the practiced ease of someone who had found his calling in this strange new world of electronic warfare. At 22 years old, Chen had scored in the top 2% of his radar operator training class, demonstrating an almost intuitive understanding of the equipment that impressed even his instructors. The son of Chinese immigrants who had built a small grocery business in San Francisco's Chinatown, Chen had volunteered for military service the day after Pearl Harbor, driven by a fury that still burned 3 years later. His parents had raised him on stories of Japanese atrocities in China, of the rape of Nanking, and the brutal occupation that had killed distant relatives he had never met. When the attack on Pearl Harbor came, Chen saw it as both a personal affront. He had expected to serve in some menial capacity, perhaps as a cook or supply clerk, given the racial prejudices that still permeated American society in the early 1940s. Instead, he had discovered that the Navy desperately needed men who could master the complex new radar systems being installed across the fleet. Pattern recognition, mathematical precision, the ability to translate electronic signals into tactical information. These skills mattered more than skin color or ethnic background in the radar rooms where America's technological advantage was being forged. Chen had found a place where his abilities were valued, where he could contribute directly to defeating the enemy in ways that traditional combat roles might never have allowed. The SG surface search radar humming behind them represented the cutting edge of allied technological innovation. Developed through intensive research and engineering efforts that mobilized America's best scientific minds, the system could detect surface targets at ranges exceeding 40 kilometers under favorable conditions. More critically, it functioned with equal effectiveness regardless of darkness, fog, rain, or any other weather condition that rendered traditional visual detection impossible. Chen's voice remained calm and professional as he reported his findings. The Patterson could hear the underlying excitement that every radar operator felt when the system performed exactly as designed. The 3 Japanese ships were maintaining perfect formation spacing, their approximate displacement suggesting destroyer-class vessels. Speed was holding steady at 22 knots. They were proceeding with the confidence of forces that believed themselves invisible and undetectable. Patterson allowed himself a tight smile as he studied the tactical situation developing on the glowing screen before him. The Japanese had radar technology of their own, certainly. But Japanese radar was primitive by comparison to Allied systems, plagued by reliability issues and limited range that made it an unreliable sensor at best. More critically, Japanese naval doctrine had failed to fully integrate radar into tactical thinking, treating it as a backup to traditional visual methods rather than the primary detection system had become for American forces. This doctrinal failure represented perhaps the most significant advantage American forces possessed. It was not merely that Allied radar was technically superior, though it certainly was. The real advantage lay in how thoroughly American naval operations had been restructured around radar capability. Fire control systems, tactical formations, engagement doctrine, training programs. Captain William Bradley entered the radar room, his weathered face betraying none of the excitement Patterson knew the commanding officer must be feeling. At 48 years old, Bradley had commanded destroyers since before the war began, accumulating thousands of hours of sea time, unlike some older officers who viewed radar with suspicion or outright hostility, treating it as some newfangled gadget that could never replace experienced lookouts and traditional seamanship. Bradley had embraced the technology with an enthusiasm that inspired his entire crew, and spent countless hours in the radar room learning to interpret the displays with the same fluency he brought to reading charts and weather patterns. He understood intuitively that naval warfare was undergoing a fundamental transformation, and officers who failed to adapt would find themselves as obsolete as the sailing ship captains who had resisted steam propulsion in an earlier era. Bradley's voice carried the calm authority of a commander who had already planned every move of the upcoming engagement. They had a clear tactical picture, perfect knowledge of enemy positions, despite conditions that rendered visual detection completely impossible. The fog that the Japanese trusted so completely would prove utterly transparent to American electronic eyes. It was the kind of overwhelming advantage that could transform a dangerous encounter into a one-sided engagement, where the outcome was never really in doubt. Patterson confirmed that they could position themselves across the Japanese task force as projected path approximately 38 minutes. The fog would keep American ships invisible to Japanese lookouts until they were within 500 meters, by which time the engagement would already be decided. The enemy would never see their attackers until shells were already impacting against their hulls. But the Fletcher was not alone in these waters. Two sister destroyers, the Nicholas and the O'Bannon, cruised in formation 3,000 meters to port and starboard. All three ships were connected by secure radio communication and guided by the Fletcher's radar picture, which was being continuously broadcast to provide coordinated tactical information. 9 5-inch guns, dozens of smaller caliber weapons, and torpedo tubes carrying Mark 15 torpedoes against 3 Japanese destroyers caught completely by surprise. Bradley considered the tactical situation for several long moments, his mind running through options with the speed of long experience. They could engage immediately, opening fire at maximum range and relying on radar-directed gunnery to find targets the crews could not see. Or they could maneuver closer, positioning themselves for a devastating point-blank engagement that would give the Japanese no chance to respond effectively. He wanted his ships positioned perfectly, wanted the first salvo to be absolutely devastating, wanted to demonstrate beyond any doubt the superiority of radar-guided combat over traditional visual methods. This engagement would provide data that would inform tactical doctrine for years to come, and Bradley intended to make it a textbook example of how electronic warfare had transformed naval combat. The Fletcher and her sisters would move silently to general quarters, every man reaching his battle station without sounding the usual alarm klaxons that might theoretically be heard across the water. They would position themselves in a perfect ambush configuration, waiting until the Japanese ships sailed directly into a trap they could not detect. Then they would open fire with carefully controlled salvos, using radar to maintain perfect knowledge of target positions, even as the fog rendered visual targeting completely impossible. As the American crews moved to battle stations with practiced efficiency, trained by endless drills to perform their functions with maximum speed and minimum communication, Captain Yamamoto remained blissfully unaware on the bridge of the Akatsuki. The fog had grown even thicker, if such a thing were possible, reducing the visible world to a tiny bubble of gray nothingness that extended barely 25 meters in any direction. His ship was a ghost, invisible and untouchable, carrying out its vital mission exactly as planned. Lieutenant Sato completed another inspection tour through the ship's interior spaces, returning with reports that morale remained high despite the oppressive conditions. The protective fog that surrounded them had transformed a dangerous mission into something that felt almost routine. Several crew members expressed gratitude for weather that neutralized American advantages in aircraft and numbers. Yamamoto shared their confidence, though years of combat experience had taught him never to become complacent. He had fought Americans since the war's opening days, had faced their growing numerical superiority and increasing aggression with tactical skill and the advantages of superior night fighting capabilities and better torpedoes. The fog was simply another form of the darkness that had always favored Japanese forces in surface engagements. His lookouts, men trained through endless drills to spot tiny details in low-light conditions, scanned the surrounding fog with eyes that had been adapted through years of specialized training. The fog had reduced the world to a small sphere of gray emptiness where even their companion destroyers were invisible most of the time, only briefly appearing as ghostly shadows when the distance between ships temporarily closed. What Captain Yamamoto could not see, could not even imagine, was the perfect electronic picture building aboard the Fletcher as Patterson and Chen tracked his every movement with mechanical precision. The radar painted a picture of reality that was actually clearer and more accurate than visual observation would have been under perfect conditions. Every parameter tracked and updated with each sweep of the rotating antenna. The Japanese ships were maintaining course and speed with no evasive maneuvers, no indication they suspected anything whatsoever. The range continued to decrease steadily as both forces closed on each other, a combined speed of 44 knots. 42,000 meters, 38,000 meters, 34,000 meters. Each update brought the moment of engagement closer. The radar picture showed the tactical situation with a clarity that would have seemed like magic or witchcraft just a few years earlier. It was like playing chess against an opponent who could not see the board, who did not even realize the game had begun. Their Type 93 torpedoes were genuinely superior to anything in American arsenals, capable of ranges and speeds that made them devastating weapons in the hands of well-trained crews. Their optical equipment was excellent. Their sailors expertly drilled in night combat techniques that had proven decisive in numerous early war engagements. For the first year of the Pacific War, these advantages had translated into victory after victory, sinking Allied ships with a regularity that had seemed to confirm Japanese naval superiority. But technology moved faster than doctrine, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had failed to recognize that the fundamental nature of naval warfare was changing beneath their feet. American industrial capacity was not merely producing more ships. It was producing better ships equipped with technologies that rendered traditional advantages obsolete. Radar was only the most obvious example. Improved fire control systems, better damage control procedures, enhanced anti-aircraft capabilities, more effective torpedoes. The technological gap was widening with each passing month, and Japanese forces were fighting a war using doctrines developed for a previous era. Captain Bradley stood in the Fletcher's pilot house, watching the fog swirl past the windows while mentally composing his attack plan with the precision of a chess master planning several moves ahead. The radar picture was being continuously updated and communicated to companion ships via secure radio channels. All three destroyers were moving into position with mechanical precision, guided by electronic eyes that rendered the fog meaningless as an obstacle to coordination or targeting. Prepare firing solutions for all main batteries using radar-derived range and bearing data. They might only get one chance before the Japanese reacted, and Bradley intended to make those first seconds of engagement count for everything. Muzzle flashes would be hidden, making it difficult for Japanese forces to determine exact American positions even after the engagement began. The confusion would be total and overwhelming, making coordinated enemy response essentially impossible. Lieutenant Commander Patterson climbed to the bridge carrying the latest plotting data, showing how the tactical picture was developing exactly as projected. In 12 more minutes, the Fletcher and her sisters would be positioned in perfect ambush configuration, with the three Japanese destroyers sailing directly into a trap they could not detect and could not escape. The contrast in situational awareness between the two forces was absolute and overwhelming. Aboard the Akatsuki, Captain Yamamoto continued navigating by compass and dead reckoning, trusting in his crew's training and the protective fog that surrounded them like an invisible shield. His lookout stared into gray nothingness, seeing nothing because visibility remained essentially zero. The ship's Type 22 radar set remained switched off to reduce electromagnetic emissions that might theoretically be detected by enemy equipment, following doctrine that emphasized stealth over electronic detection. Japanese concerns about radar detection had led them to turn off the one device that might have provided warning, while American radar operators tracked their every movement with casual confidence and mechanical precision. It was a perfect encapsulation of how doctrinal failures could negate even superior courage and training. Formation spacing remained perfect, suggesting experienced crews maintaining textbook destroyer screen configuration. The Japanese ships were sailing toward their fate with the inevitability of Greek tragedy. Aboard the Akatsuki, Lieutenant Sato commented to Captain Yamamoto about how smoothly the mission was proceeding. Seas remained calm, fog provided perfect concealment, and they would reach their delivery point with time to spare. Several crew members passing through the bridge wore expressions of relief, grateful for a mission that seemed to be unfolding without complications or unexpected challenges. Yamamoto nodded his agreement while maintaining the caution that had kept him alive through years of combat. He had survived by never taking anything for granted, by always assuming the enemy was more capable than they appeared. Yet even his caution could not prepare him for what was about to occur, because he was operating within a paradigm that had already become obsolete. The rules he had learned, the doctrine he had mastered, the advantages he had exploited. All of it was about to be revealed as outdated, insufficient, and tragically inadequate against an enemy who had fundamentally changed how naval warfare was conducted. The engagement began at 0-to-30-7 hours when Captain Bradley gave the order to open fire. The Fletcher's 5-inch guns roared to life with a violence that seemed to tear the night itself, their muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the fog before being swallowed by the gray mist. The shells, guided by radar-derived firing solutions that provided accuracy impossible through visual sighting alone, crossed 23,000 meters in 28 seconds before impacting along the Akatsuki's starboard side. The effect on Captain Yamamoto and his crew was electrifying, terrifying, and completely disorienting in equal measure. One moment they had been steaming through protective fog, invisible and untouchable, confident in their mission and their advantages. The next moment, with absolutely no warning whatsoever, shells were impacting against their ship with shocking accuracy, arriving from a direction where no enemy should exist, where no enemy could exist according to every principle of naval warfare that Yamamoto had learned over 2 decades of service. The captain's mind raced through possibilities with desperate speed, trying to comprehend what was happening and how to respond. All guns commenced firing on approximate enemy bearings. But there was nothing to see except fog and darkness, no muzzle flashes to mark enemy positions, no visual reference points whatsoever to guide a response. It was like being struck by the hand of an invisible god, attacked by ghosts who could see through any concealment and strike with precision that defied explanation. Lieutenant Sato rushed to the communication station, desperately trying to coordinate with their companion ships while simultaneously attempting to understand how the enemy had found them. The fog remained as thick as ever, visibility still measured in mere meters rather than hundreds or thousands. Yet the Americans were engaging with an accuracy that suggested perfect knowledge of Japanese positions, perfect understanding of their course and speed, perfect ability to track and target despite conditions that should have rendered such precision impossible. The second salvo arrived 30 seconds after the first, and this time the shells found even more critical areas of the ship. The Akatsuki's forward gun mount took a direct impact that killed the entire crew instantly and put the weapon out of action. Fire erupted from the damaged area, flames casting an orange glow through the fog that ironically made them an even easier target for attackers they still could not see. Additional shells found the bridge superstructure, destroying communication equipment and killing 2 of Yamamoto's senior officers. The captain himself survived only through luck, thrown to the deck by the blast, but miraculously uninjured. As he pulled himself upright, ears ringing and mind struggling to process the catastrophe unfolding around him, He finally understood with terrible clarity what was happening. The Americans had found some way to see through the fog, to track Japanese ships with perfect accuracy despite conditions that rendered traditional visual detection completely impossible. The implications were staggering, threatening to overturn everything he had learned about naval warfare over his entire career. The fog was not protecting them. The darkness meant nothing. Traditional advantages in night vision and visual detection had become irrelevant against an enemy who possessed electronic eyes that could pierce any concealment. Patterson watched the radar display as the three Japanese ships broke formation, each attempting independent evasive maneuvers in desperate efforts to escape the ambush. But their movements were tracked with perfect fidelity by the SG radar, each course change displayed in real time on the glowing screen. The fog that had seemed like such perfect protection was revealed as utterly meaningless against electronic detection. Ships that appeared invisible to human eyes showed up as clear blips on radar screens, their positions tracked with mechanical precision regardless of weather or lighting conditions. Chen maintained his professional calm despite the intensity of the engagement, providing continuous updates that allowed American guns to follow Japanese maneuvers with an accuracy that must have seemed supernatural to the enemy crews. Target 1 altering course to port, speed increasing to 28 knots. Target 2 executing emergency turn to starboard. Target 3 maintaining original course but increasing speed. All targets remained clearly tracked despite evasive maneuvers. The Ubanan and Nicholas had joined the engagement now, their guns adding to the devastation being visited upon the Japanese task force. The three American destroyers fired in carefully controlled salvos, using radar to maintain perfect knowledge of target positions, even as the fog rendered visual targeting completely impossible. It was precision gunnery elevated to a level that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier, made possible by technology that transformed warfare itself. Aboard the Akatsuki, Captain Yamamoto made the hardest decision of his military career. The ship was taking damage faster than crews could control the fires and flooding. 2 of their 3 companion destroyers had sustained serious hits, their combat capabilities severely degraded. The mission had become impossible. Survival itself was now questionable. His voice was tight with strain as he gave the orders that represented acknowledgement of defeat and recognition of obsolescence. All ships execute dispersal pattern 7 and increase speed to maximum. Launch torpedoes on approximate enemy bearings and then disengage at best possible speed. We cannot fight what we cannot see. Every word felt like acid on his tongue, admitting tactical failure and doctrinal inadequacy in the face of enemy capabilities he barely understood. The Japanese torpedoes launched in desperation toward approximate American positions, but without accurate targeting data, even the vaunted long lance was useless. The weapons missed their intended targets by thousands of meters, their range and power meaningless when they could not find what they were supposed to destroy. The American ships, guided by continuous radar tracking, maneuvered around the torpedo spreads with ease, never breaking contact with their quarry. Lieutenant Sato approached Captain Yamamoto with a damage report that confirmed what they both already knew. The Akatsuki had sustained serious damage, 4 gun mount destroyed, multiple fires burning throughout the ship, combat capability severely degraded. The Ikazuchi had disappeared into the fog, hopefully escaping but their fate unknown. The Inazuma was limping away trailing smoke, her speed reduced by engineering casualties. Yamamoto stood on the bridge as his ship retreated at reduced speed, trailing smoke and with nearly a quarter of his crew requiring medical attention or already dead. He replayed the engagement in his mind with the obsessive focus of a man trying to understand how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. They had done everything correctly according to established doctrine, used weather to their advantage, maintained formation discipline, posted vigilant lookouts, executed evasive maneuvers with precision when attacked. None of it had mattered. Not skill, not experience, not courage, not tactical knowledge accumulated over decades of service. The Americans possessed a capability that rendered all traditional advantages obsolete, and Japanese forces had no effective counter. Patterson and Chen remain at their stations in the Fletcher's radar room, tracking the withdrawing Japanese ships until they finally moved beyond effective radar range. The engagement had lasted less than 30 minutes, yet it represented a fundamental shift in the nature of naval warfare that would only become more apparent as the war continued. The fog, the darkness, the careful concealment. All of it had been meaningless against electronic eyes that could see through any obstacle. Captain Bradley assembled his officers for a brief after-action discussion while the crew secured from general quarters. The Fletcher had expended 127 rounds of 5-inch ammunition and had not sustained so much as a scratch in return. The raider had performed flawlessly throughout the engagement, providing continuous tracking despite weather conditions that had rendered traditional visual detection completely impossible. Bradley's words to his assembled officers carried the weight of recognition that they had participated in something historically significant. What we accomplished tonight is going to become the standard for naval operations moving forward. The fog was irrelevant, darkness was irrelevant. Traditional concealment was meaningless. We had perfect information about enemy positions while they had essentially none about ours. That is not just a tactical advantage, that represents a fundamental revolution in how naval warfare is conducted. The captain was correct, though even he could not fully appreciate how profound the transformation would prove to be. Radar technology would continue advancing at breathtaking pace, each improvement further eroding the advantages that Japanese forces had relied upon since the war began. Long-lens torpedoes, superior night optics, extensive training in visual detection, all of these became secondary factors when the enemy could see through fog and darkness with electronic eyes that never tired, never lost focus, and never failed to detect targets within their range. For Captain Yamamoto, the night's engagement marked the beginning of a painful education in technological warfare. He would survive the war, living to see Japan surrender in August 1945, watching American occupation forces move through a defeated nation. But the confident officer, who had smiled in the fog that November night was forever changed. He would command ships again, would fight more engagements, but never with the same absolute confidence in traditional naval doctrine that had characterized his earlier service. The fog engagement had revealed a truth that Yamamoto could not unlearn. Modern warfare was increasingly about technological capability rather than courage or skill. Industrial capacity to produce and deploy advanced systems mattered more than individual training or tactical excellence. The Americans were not merely building more ships. They were building better ships equipped with technologies that rendered traditional Japanese advantages obsolete. The Akatsuki would return to base for repairs that took 6 weeks to complete. During that time, Yamamoto filed detailed reports about the engagement, describing how Americans had tracked his ships through conditions that should have rendered detection impossible. His reports were read by intelligence officers who were beginning to understand that the Allies had developed radar capabilities far beyond what Japanese forces possessed. But understanding the problem and solving it were two entirely different things. Japanese industry lacked the capacity to match American technological advances while simultaneously maintaining existing operations and replacing losses that mounted with every passing month. The industrial gap was simply too wide, the technological disparity too great. Japan was fighting a war it could not win, not because its sailors lacked courage or skill, but because the fundamental economic and technological foundations of victory had shifted beyond reach. Lieutenant Sato would be transferred to a cruiser operating in the Philippines, where he would survive until April 1945 before being evacuated due to injuries sustained when American aircraft attacked his ship in Manila Bay. He would later describe the fog engagement as the moment he first understood that Japan was fighting a losing war. Not because of any lack of bravery among its forces, but because the industrial and technological gap was simply insurmountable. Seaman Chen would continue operating radar equipment aboard the Fletcher till the war's end, participating in 17 more surface engagements where American technological superiority proved decisive. He would return to San Francisco in December 1945, marry his childhood sweetheart, and eventually work as an engineer for a company developing commercial radar systems for maritime navigation. He would always remember the night in the fog as the engagement where technology proved more powerful than courage, training, or traditional tactical excellence. Lieutenant Commander Patterson would be promoted to full commander and given his own destroyer command in early 1944. He would spend the remainder of his naval career advocating for radar technology and training crews in its effective use. His post-war memoir, published in 1953, would include a chapter about the fog engagement, describing it as a perfect example of how information superiority could transform tactical situations and make numerical or positional advantages irrelevant. Captain Bradley would retire from the Navy in 1951 as a rear admiral, having commanded increasingly larger formations as the war progressed. His final assignment before retirement was helping to develop doctrine for integrating radar technology with naval aviation, continuing the revolution that had begun with simple surface search sets like the one aboard the Fletcher. The engagement in the fog on November 14, 1943, was not historically significant in terms of ships destroyed or casualties inflicted. It would barely merit a footnote in comprehensive histories of the Pacific War, overshadowed by larger battles at Midway, Leyte Gulf, and the Philippine Sea, but for the men who participated, it represented something profound and transformative. A moment when old rules stopped applying and new realities became undeniable. Japanese naval doctrine, built on decades of tradition and refined through years of combat experience, had encountered a technological capability that rendered much of that tradition obsolete. The fog that had seemed like such perfect protection was revealed as utterly transparent to electronic eyes. Careful training in night vision and visual detection became secondary when the enemy could track movements with radar. The advantage of superior torpedoes meant nothing when targeting data was fundamentally unreliable because you could not see what you were shooting at. American forces, meanwhile, had embraced new technology with enthusiasm born of necessity and supported by industrial capacity that could deploy innovations across entire fleets. The SG radar sets that made the fog engagement possible were being installed on dozens of ships every month, creating a systematic advantage that only grew more pronounced as the war continued. Each new ship rolled out of American shipyards equipped with the latest radar, fire control systems, and communication equipment, widening the technological gap with every passing month. Japanese forces would occasionally achieve tactical successes through courage, skill, and the occasional exploitation of American mistakes, but they were fighting against an opponent that could see in darkness, track through fog, coordinate forces with precision that traditional methods could not match, and replace losses faster than Japanese forces could inflict them. The mathematics of attrition warfare became increasingly unfavorable, and no amount of individual bravery could overcome systemic disadvantages in industrial capacity and technological innovation. In the decades following the war, naval historians would identify radar development as one of the key technological advantages that enabled Allied victory in the Pacific. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, various engagements around Guadalcanal, surface actions in the Solomon Islands. All of these demonstrated how electronic detection had transformed naval warfare fundamentally and irreversibly. Ships that had seemed invisible to traditional lookouts showed up as clear blips on radar screens, their positions tracked with mechanical precision regardless of weather or lighting conditions. Night fighting advantages that Japanese forces had spent years developing became meaningless when American ships could engage with equal effectiveness in darkness or daylight, fog or clear weather. For Captain Yamamoto, standing on a dock in Yokosuka after the war ended, watching American occupation forces move through a defeated Japan, the memory of that foggy night remained vivid and painful. He had been so confident, so certain that the fog would protect his task force from detection. The shock of those first shells arriving from an invisible enemy, the frustrated attempts to respond to attackers he could not see, the bitter recognition that traditional naval warfare had been fundamentally transformed by technology he barely understood and could not counter. He would tell the story to his grandchildren years later, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. He described how confidence and experience had proved meaningless against an enemy who possessed better tools. It was a lesson about hubris, certainly about the danger of assuming that advantages would remain permanent, but it was also a lesson about the pace of technological change and the importance of adapting to new realities rather than clinging to traditional methods that had become obsolete. The fog had been real enough, thick and concealing, reducing visibility to almost nothing. They had electronic eyes that penetrated fog as easily as clear air, tracked movement with mechanical precision, and provided targeting information that made visual detection irrelevant. The world had changed, and Japanese forces had failed to change with it. The Solomon Sea returned to peace in August 1945, its waters no longer contested by warring fleets. The fog still rolled across its surface on humid nights, creating the same conditions that had given Captain Yamamoto such false confidence 2 years earlier. But the ships that would eventually travel those waters in peacetime carried radar as standard equipment, the technology having become so ubiquitous that it was impossible to imagine navigating without it. The revolution that began with crude, surface-search radars would continue accelerating through the Cold War and beyond. Radar-guided missiles, satellite surveillance, electronic warfare systems that could jam or deceive enemy sensors. The fog engagement represented just one early step in a transformation that would make warfare increasingly dependent on technological sophistication rather than traditional military virtues. Captain Yamamoto's experience, multiplied across thousands of Japanese officers and sailors who encountered similar technological shocks throughout the Pacific War, represented the painful education of an entire military establishment. The lessons were hard-learned and came at terrible cost. Technological superiority could overcome numerical inferiority. Industrial capacity to innovate and deploy new systems mattered more than traditional tactical excellence. Wars were won not merely on battlefields, but in laboratories and factories where new capabilities were developed and mass-produced. For the American sailors who participated in the fog engagement, the experience reinforced confidence in technology and innovation. They had seen firsthand how electronic systems could provide decisive advantages that translated directly into victory. The radar room aboard the Fletcher was not merely a technical space filled with equipment. It was the nerve center of modern naval warfare, the place where information superiority was generated and maintained. The engagement demonstrated principles that would remain relevant long after World War II ended. Information dominance as a prerequisite for tactical success. The importance of integrating new technologies into operational doctrine rather than treating them as supplementary to traditional methods. The need for continuous innovation and adaptation in response to technological change. These lessons would inform military thinking for generations, shaping how armed forces approached modernization and capability development. As the decades passed and the fog engagement faded from immediate memory into history, its significance remained clear to military professionals who studied the Pacific War. It represented a perfect case study of how technological advantage could transform tactical situations, how doctrine needed to evolve with capabilities, and how failure to adapt to new realities could result in defeat despite courage, skill, and determination. The invisible eyes that tracked Captain Yamamoto's ships through the fog that November night were harbingers of a future where warfare would increasingly be conducted through electronic systems rather than visual observation. The revolution had begun, and there would be no going back to an earlier age where fog provided protection and darkness favored the well-trained. Technology had changed the rules permanently, and those who failed to adapt would find themselves as obsolete as wooden sailing ships in an age of steel and steam.